Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Zheng Liu, lecturer in innovation management at the University of Bristol Business School, UK, who joins us to unpack the central ideas from her acclaimed book, Cultural Mavericks, the Business and Politics of Independent Bookselling in China. Dr. Cheng is the Program Pathway Lead and Unit Director for the MSc Management, that is Digitalization and Big Data Program, a member of the University of Bristol Research Ethics Committee, and convener of the British Sociological Association Theory Study Group. She is also affiliated with the Bristol Digital Future Institute, Cambridge Digital Humanities, and the Department of Sociology and Jesus College at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Leo holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Cambridge. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Zheng Liu to the conversation. Dr. Zheng, it's a distinguished privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Deepak. Thank you very much for having me here today. And I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you and your audience, your global audience, about this book. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Zheng, your books open up the world's China's independent bookstores, which differ both from state-owned Xinhua outlets and other private shops. How do these bookstores define independence in their own terms? And how does they differ from Western notion of independent bookselling?
Yeah, so this is a very good first question to open up this interview. So I think as I kind of write in my book, so independent bookstores in China, they define their independent identity in terms of three kind of main criteria. So the first criteria is in terms of their ownership structure. So basically, independent bookstores must be non-state-owned enterprises. So this is to differentiate these bookstores from the state-owned Xinhua bookstore, which is the absolute leader player in the Chinese bookselling industry, including those online retailers. But the state-owned Xinhua bookstore chains are the absolute industry leaders in this field. So for independent bookstores to be non-state-owned, this is really help them to distinguish them from their main competitor in a sense. So this is also the most kind of important and basic criterion for claiming the independent identity in the Chinese context. And also this is one criterion which is not relevant to how independence is defined or understood in the Western or Anglo-American bookselling context, as you well know, right? So the second criterion has to do with operational autonomy. That is, as independent bookstores, you need to have, or you should have, full control of your key business decision making, and you should not be subjected to any external organizations or individuals' orders, whether this is a corporate headquarter, an investor, or someone from the government. So operational autonomy is absolutely essential for claiming the independent status. And the third main criteria has to do with expectations that independent bookstores should have a strong personality or character. So some booksellers I talk to even argue that this is the single most important criterion for determining the independent status. And I must say that this third criterion might also be relevant to how independent booksellers in the West define define their independent identity. So there is a clear kind of overlap or similarity between how Chinese and Western independent booksellers understand this identity. But also, I think the difference or the distinction is also very relevant and important for us to understand, which is kind of why I decided to write this book and decided to do the research, really.
Dr. Chen, you describe independent bookstores as emphasizing intellectual independence and the free exchange of ideas and pursuing a sense of cultural distinction. In practice, what does that look like on the ground in their curation, events, and daily interactions with readers?
Yes, very good question. I think in the book, I discussed three main areas where these bookstores translate their visions and ambitions into practices, really. I demonstrated, for example, when selecting books, these independent bookstores would definitely focus on high quality non-fiction works and high literature, especially what they call scholarly books. scholarly books in the Chinese book selling context mainly refers to academic books and academic and trade crossover books in disciplines such as philosophy, history, political science, political studies, sociology, economics, and so on and so forth. So by focusing on this kind of books, these bookstores really prioritize the quality and the cultural and intellectual impact of their books over sales and profits. So this is the first thing that they would do to definitely, convey that their independent, their intellectual independence and their commitment to cultural distinction and free exchange of ideas. But they also do other things, you know. The second thing I described in my book is how independent bookstores would design and decorate their stores in such a way that they can showcase their visions and ambitions in a more kind of visual way. For example, many independent bookstores would feature a distinctive Western cultural atmosphere to distinguish themselves from the mainstream bookstores, the state-owned Xinhua bookstores, as I mentioned, as a way of signaling their autonomy and independence and cultural distinction. So, even to this day, Western culture or linkages to Western culture is still, widely deemed by some Chinese consumers as, a signaling or indicating kind of high culture. So this is what independent, so basically independent bookstores also, take that cue, and then they would basically design their space to exuberate that kind of Western culture linkages to appeal to that specific kind of section of customers. And lastly, events are another important avenue for these bookstores to create a space for dialogues and for alternative culture and intellectual exchanges. So you may very likely to see events featuring authors or performers or artists that are not normally very visible on the mainstream platforms. And some independent bookstores are really serious about, providing these individuals an opportunity or arena to be more visible to the public. I think this is the third way kind of they translate their culture, visions, and commitments into day-to-day bookselling practices. Yeah.
Dr. Chen, the book is based on more than a decade of immersive research, including interviews, observations, and documentary analysis. Can you share a moment from your fieldwork, perhaps in a particular bookstore, that fundamentally changed how you understood this ecosystem?
Yeah, definitely. I think it must be, it has to be how so many of the independent bookstores that I visited actually they chose to decorate their stores with pictures of famous figures in the Western culture and literally worlds. The most kind of, in terms of pictures, I mean like portraits of those famous authors and artists. So the most popular ones included Oscar Wilde, um, Ernest Hemingway, Virginia Woolf, George Orwell, to name only a few. So basically, as I said in my book, soon after I started my fieldwork, I almost lost account of the number of times I saw yet another Oscar Wilde or Hemingway pictures in the independent bookstores that I visited. They were literally ubiquitous, and I didn't know why. I just felt that I kept seeing just another picture of Wilde or another picture of George Orwell, for example. But now I understand why, obviously. I think that the rationale behind this, as I argued in the book, is that by displaying these images, these pictures, they're all kind of wide, Western, very famous kind of authors and literary figures. By displaying these images, I think the independent bookstores, what they seek to do is to create and highlight a Western culture kind of a link to the Western culture and a distinctive Western culture ambience that would unmistakably help themselves to distinguish them from, other bookstores, their competitors in the marketplace, especially the state-owned bookstore and those more, commercially driven, privately owned bookstores. I think for the state-owned bookstores and those more commercially driven, privately owned bookstores, they simply aren't very, interested. They don't really bother with how their store environment would look like because they can just keep shifting in very large volumes of those best-selling titles that they sell, but which independent bookstores, would consider too commercial to even stock in their shops. So in order to distinguish themselves from those competitors, they choose to highlight their Western culture kind of connections.
Don't you think you introduced the concept of culturally adapted strategy to explain how independent bookstores balance economic survival with a commitment to intellectual autonomy? Can you unpack this concept for us and perhaps illustrate it with one or two concrete strategic choices bookstores make?
Yeah, so this concept, yeah, it can be a little kind of theoretical for people unfamiliar with this concepts to basically understand what I mean by culturally adapted strategies. But basically, what I mean is these strategies are strategies for competition. So basically, they are commercial strategies that these bookstores use to better compete in a very intensely competitive bookselling market. And these strategies have been culturally adapted. Well, I'll explain one by one so that your audience will understand this a little bit better. So basically, I explained three culturally adapted strategies in the book. Political framing basically refers to how these bookstores would deliberately but very carefully include some politically invocative elements in their stores as a way of differentiating themselves from state-owned Xinhua bookstores or other competitors, as well as to attract like-minded customers. So examples for this strategy would include, for example, featuring certain types of books or books by politically controversial authors in their stores. For example, George Orwell's 1984 is a long-time favorite by many of the independent bookstores I studied, but there are other examples as well. So this is the first kind of culturally adapted strategy. And the second one being in moral positioning, it refers to how independent bookstores would position themselves as defenders of culture and ethical standards in the Chinese bookselling world, also mainly as a way to distinguish themselves from their competitors. So in practice, influenced by this strategy, independent bookstores would, for example, avoid or eschew from selling bookselling titles or bookselling genres and from participating in those very kind of cutthroat price war-based competitions. And this helps some independent bookstores to attract and build a loyal kind of customer base who share their aversion of the heavy commercialism in the Chinese book retailing field. So that's why I call it moral positioning, because they do not only see themselves as cultural custodians, which is the case for Western independent booksellers, but also they are there to kind of defend the ethical and the normal orders in the bookselling world, which they say as has been kind of disrupted very badly by online booksellers who would basically wage price wars relentlessly. And so yeah, that's why I call it moral positioning. It's not just about culture, kind of defending your cultural standards and stuff like that. Okay, so the last kind of strategy is cultural distinguishing. I think this one is very self-explanatory. So basically, it refers to how these bookstores try to create a sense of cultural distinction and even cultural elitism to attract those wealthy Chinese middle-class customers who seek a sense of cultural distinction by consuming those highly priced cultural goods and services, such as those ones sold in many of those independent bookstores. Not all of the independent bookstores do this. Some bookstores sell books at reasonable prices, sell non-book stuff at reasonable prices, but many independent bookstores they do sell books at not very unreasonable high prices in my view. So I kind of explain that phenomenon as they are exercising the strategy of cultural distinguishing. Yeah.
Dr. Cheng, many outside observers tend to see non-state cultural institutions in China, primarily through the lens of resistance. You argue that independent bookstores engage with politics more as a strategic means of differentiation.
Yes.
How does this more nuanced perspective change the way we should think about culture and politics in contemporary China?
Yeah, I think this is actually a very, very important point. It is very important, for people to remember that the Chinese book industry or the wider Chinese cultural industries, it's that they're actually very commercial. That they would they're very commercially driven and they're very, very capitalist. And in some sense, you can even argue that they're more capitalist than the Western bookselling industry. I'll explain this in a moment. So I think that it will be convenient but wrong to consider all of the happenings in the Chinese bookselling industry mainly through the lens of, the lens of resistance or the lens of state market struggles or state society struggles. I would argue instead that at least in the field of bookselling, political interventions are very, very kind of minimal. The state really maintains minimal control in the daily activities of the bookstores, apart from the normal regulatory kind of necessities. But apart from that, really, the control is very kind of minimal. And this makes it very interesting actually to see how, in this situation, how many of these independent bookstores, they would deliberately, but as I said, deliberately but carefully engage with political or politicalized narratives or discourses as a way of signaling their distinction, their market distinction. So they are fairly creatively making use of this. So basically what they're doing here is that they are very creatively making use of this perceived tension between state and non-state cultural production to their own economic advantage when actually the state control is, as I said, very minimal. So I think this is what is really, really interesting about dissecting and demystifying these nuanced dynamics, rather than just considering all of this in the blanket resistance-centric rhetoric, which is very popular kind of in the existing literature on Chinese non-state cultural production, because people just tend to say that, oh, it's non-state, so it means that they're resisting censorship or authoritarianism. Actually, at least in the field of independent bookselling, that is not the case. Basically, I think that in my study, I just found, the resistance-centered rhetoric or explanation, that framework is simply very unattainable in explaining the behavior of independent bookstores, which I felt, a strong need to sort of like to say, okay, I don't think that's the case. I think what they're basically doing, these independent bookstores, they're driven by their need to be more competitive, and their strategies are indeed strategies of differentiation instead of strategies of resistance.
Dr. Cheng, the book situates these bookstores within rapidly shifting social, political, and economical dynamics, including the pressures of the digital age and online retail. What are some of the most significant challenges they face from e-commerce platforms and digital reading habits? And how have the more successful stores responded?
Yeah. So as I said, the Chinese book selling really is very commercially driven. It's very, very commercial, and it can be more commercial and capitalist than, for example, the book selling industry here in the UK, in the sense that there is virtually no restrictions on things like how low a price, a retailer can sell a book at. For example, in the UK and the US, I don't know much about India, obviously, but in the UK and the US, after years of struggles with publishers and the regulators and authors and public, actually, Amazon nowadays actually they do not really sell books at ridiculously low prices. Actually, there have been cases where I could buy books cheaper at my local bookstores than ordering from Amazon. But in China, it is totally different. So online book, Amazon is no longer operating in China, but you have the Chinese platforms like Amazon. But in China, these online booksellers, including these both large kind of platforms and the smaller sellers who, trade on those platforms, they can really sell books at ridiculously low prices, so much so that there is simply no way for physical bookstores like independent bookstores to compete with them. So I think this is one very important kind of, feature to remember about, how bookselling in China really operates. It's really, really commercially driven. It's really, really market kind of driven and very capitalistic. So as such, many independent bookstores, they really do not have much choice, but in terms of selling books, but resort to diversification, which was why, as I explain in my book, although I am fully aware that many independent bookstores or non-independent bookstores in the UK and US, and they also sell coffee and stationery and gifts very heavily. They sell those non-book stuff. But I feel that for many of the Chinese independent bookstores that I studied, this non-book sales, it is non-book business lines were absolutely their lifeline. So as such, you would see that Chinese independent bookstores have taken bookstore diversification almost to another whole new level in terms of the breadth of the non-book products that this store can sell in their stores. So I think this is so respond to your questions of how have some more successful how some successful bookstores responded. I would say that they responded by diversification, by very clever diversification into non-book non-book kind of business lines. This is kind of very important. And but I would also like to kind of emphasize is that this strategy, diversification, absolutely has worked quite well for many independent bookstores in the past decade. However, in recent years, as competition is getting a lot more intense in this space, the space of being, bookstores selling other non-book stuff, especially coffee and gifts and stuff. So this kind of non-book diversification strategy in recent years, has become, as the space is becoming more crowded and intense, I have seen some independent bookstores have, scaled back on this non-book kind of diversification. Instead, they've sort of like decided to refocus on books. I think this is very interesting kind of shift to observe in the bookselling industry. And I think as with any other business, there is no fixed recipe for success or failure. It's just very interesting to see how these bookstores just keep adapting to the changing market conditions to survive. I think this is the most kind of interesting thing to kind of observe what these bookstores are up doing these days. Yeah.
Dr. Cheng, you show that these stores are both cultural institutions and business enterprises. How do owners and managers negotiate the tension between curating serious or challenging content and keeping the doors open financially, especially in a market where, as some booksellers say, no bookstore can survive on book sales alone?
Yes, so basically, a widespread logic in the world of independent bookselling was that unless you own your property, that is, you don't have to pay rent for the store, it is very unlikely that you can survive on selling books alone. And this is especially true for those bookstores, independent bookstores operating in those large cities like Beijing and Shanghai. And actually, in fact, it is mainly in these large cities where you see these independent bookstores. And therefore, having some non-book business lines on the side, as I said, be it coffee or stationery or gifts, or deriving extra incomes from the owner's other income sources was deemed absolutely necessary. But as I said, things are changing. Competition in the coffee shop space is clearly getting a lot more intense than, say, 10 years ago. And also the novelty around the bookshop, coffee, gifts kind of business model is also fading, from the perspective of customers, because nowadays, even the state-owned Xinhua bookstores are also doing the same thing. They're selling coffee, they're selling those very nice, gifts and stuff. So the novelty is definitely fading. So I think all of this is pushing many independent bookstores nowadays, to just keep innovating and, to developing other more maybe new business models. And I'm very intrigued by what new business model innovations that might kind of fruit from all these kind of market changes.
Dr. Cheng, your work traces the evolution from earlier scholarly bookstores in the 1990s to today's independent bookstores. What continuities and breaks do you see across this history? And what does their trajectory tell us about broader changes in China's cultural economy?
Yeah, actually, this is a very good question. Actually, I must say that you were very scrupulous for even noticing this line of argument, because I didn't really kind of I decided not to go into a lot of details in the book, because I didn't want to confuse my readers by giving them yet another kind of terminology regarding books or scholarly academic, because I understand that the kind of the term scholarly or academic can mean something totally different So yeah, I didn't go into a lot of details into this history. However, I do think this is very important because there is clearly a linkage between these bookstores, these scholarly bookstores, which were very influential and very popular in the pre-digital era in China, and today's independent bookstores. I think actually several of the leading independent bookstores, including the Sisyphus bookstore I mentioned in my book, they were actually scholarly bookstores from the 1990s. So basically, I think the continuity has to do with the shared ethos between the scholarly bookstores from the 1990s and today's independent bookstores. I think the shared ethos really refers to an unequivocal focus on high quality academic trade crossover books in philosophy, history, political science, sociology, literary studies, and as well as translated works. Actually, I think translated works plays a very important role in these independent bookstores. As I said, they want to establish that kind of Western link connection. In terms of what broke the history, I would say it's definitely the rise of online bookstores from the early 2000s. So basically, what happened was that the competition from those online bookstores basically drove many of the old scholarly bookstores out of business overnight, leaving the survivors with no real, choice but to figure out what they could do differently, from what they probably have been doing for the past 10 or 20 years, to do differently in order to better compete with, the new players, the online bookstores. So to compete more effectively really lies in the very kind of center of what these independent bookstores do, because they were born basically as a result of the competition, waged on them by the online bookstores. So I think that the renaming also was very interesting because, the term independent, the name scholarly bookstores just sounded not very attractive to, to most customers. They would just sound very stern and even elitist. But the name independent bookstores instead sound very attractive, sounds very different. And so I think that the shifting from scholarly bookstores from the 1990s to independent bookstores of today were really primarily driven by the wider changes in the Chinese bookselling industry throughout 2000, and where the advent of online bookstores really meant bookstores selling those series works, series books must find other ways to generate sales and incomes in the face of their very formidable competitors.
Dr. Cheng, you note that independent bookstores often use political and moral positioning as a way to stand out in a crowded market. Could you give us examples of how they signal cultural sophistication or moral commitment to their customers, and how audiences respond to those signals?
Yeah, I think definitely books are definitely the first thing and the most kind of effective channels to signal your seriousness, from bookstores' perspective. And I think that as in the Anglo-American book trade, I think there is a clear sense of which books, including which publishers and even which authors are considered seriously, and which are considered like more popular, kind of commercially oriented in that sense. I think it's the same in China. So basically, as insiders of the wider kind of publishing world, whether you are a bookseller or reader, you basically have a sense of what are generally considered seriously and high quality publications and which are not. And sometimes this has to do with genres. For example, young adult fiction is generally considered not very, high quality or high literature. I think both in China and in Anglo-American trade publishing. And yeah, I think in terms of genres, publishers, and and authors of the books, I think basically this is what they do to basically to stand out in a crowded market by focusing on those high quality publications and high quality or kind of prestigious publishers. And what independent bookstores do is that they basically, apart from focusing on, I think actually is the two sides of the same coin. Basically, on the one hand, they focus on the high quality books. On the other hand, obviously, they would, as true from selling those what commonly considered as commercial books. So basically in China, which mainly refers to, apart from genres, as I said, the young adult fiction, in China, I think a very important category of books that is considered very commercial is educational books. Books like, help people to prepare for their exams, that kind of books, what I call study aid books in my book. And instead of selling these books, they would definitely focus on academic or high quality academic trade crossover titles as a way of signaling their seriousness. Obviously, not all kind of bookstore customers, kind of share this, because many independent bookstores, they do give you a sense of culture, kind of elitism, and some books, not everyone likes that, but I think for those do like this kind of ethos, and yeah, they definitely become kind of loyal audience or loyal customers of these bookstores, which explains why, despite all the difficulties and competition from online bookstores, many independent bookstores still have carved a way of survival, because they have this customer base, and also they've carved out a niche where they basically focus on this academic or high quality academic trade crossover titles, which might not be the first choices for those very commercially driven bookstores, though they definitely carved out kind of a niche market in the very competitive field of book selling in China.
But we think I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, your book offers timely insights into the evolving dynamics of China's book industry and wider cultural economy. Based on your research, what futures do you see for independent bookstores in China over the next decade? And what might their trajectory reveal about relationship between culture, commerce, and the state?
Yeah, obviously no one can predict what's going to happen in the future, but I am really a kind of firm believer in the tenacity of really kind of innovative businesses, including these independent bookstores. I think I was drawn to them because of their how innovative I think they are. And I am also a firm believer in the power of culture and human creativity. Despite the fact that actually the proliferation of AI in recent years may have in many cases proved otherwise, because nowadays you can easily read AI written novels and stuff, and some of them actually read okay. But I think that independent bookstores will continue to exist and matter in the Chinese book industry and China's wider culture and intellectual life. Although to do so for individual independent bookstores, not collectively, but for those individual bookstores, I think they must be able to adapt to the constantly changing market environment and keep cultivating new ways of creating new values for customers. So basically, that said, I do think there's one point I really want to make is that I do think that the regulators in China, they really, I think they need to make a more kind of take a more active role in guiding how the book selling industry in China is currently going and is currently operating. So far, I think the government has sought to address the chaos in the Chinese book selling industry by offering some financial support to these physical bookstores through tax relief and subsidiaries. They basically would give you subsidies directly. However, I do not think that they have, addressed these problems or the chaos in the Chinese book selling industry correctly, because obviously they are not addressing what seems to me as the bigger issues in the field, which is the cutthroat kind of price wars waged by the online retailers. I think that this is where the government should definitely be playing a more active role in regulating and even intervening to help create a fairer and more healthy bookselling industry in China. I think if that the government decided to take more active role in regulating what the online booksellers can and cannot do in terms of, in terms of how they can price their books to sell in the market, I think that will make a huge difference to the smaller kind of bricks and mortar bookstores, including bookstores. And once that happened, I believe the independent bookstores would be a much better place to keep innovating and to adapt to the kind of new world of book selling, as well as culture creation and culture production in the age of AI. So that's one point which I didn't have an opportunity to discuss in my book, but I thought your interview will be a really good opportunity for me to make that point, which is I do think the government should do more to help regulate, the bookselling market in China in terms of how online booksellers, to what extent they are allowed to discount the books they sell. I think that's a very important thing to do, in my view.
Thank you, Dr. Zheng Liu, for taking us inside the world of China's independent bookstores and for sharing the rich insights behind Cultural Mavericks, the business and politics of independent bookselling in China. Your work offers a powerful lens on how culture, commerce, and politics intersect in everyday spaces, and it has given us a lot to think about. To our listeners, we hope this conversation inspires you to look more closely at the book spaces around you and to seek out Dr. Cheng's book for a deeper dive into these remarkable cultural institutions. Thank you once again, Dr. Cheng Liu, for sharing your time and expertise with us. This has been a truly enlightening episode. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much again, Deepak, for hosting me today. Yeah, it's thoroughly very enjoyable to discuss the book with you. And yeah, thank you very much for having me, actually.
Thank you.